Hey, how's it going? It's me, the Lazy Bookworm. Welcome to my channel. Today's video is going to be something a little different. It's going to be all about poetry. No! Yes, poetry is huge. It's huge in the influence it has had over the years, but also it's huge in just the sheer output of it. There is many kinds of poetry for many kinds of people, and maybe because I'm biased because I love poetry and I also write poetry myself, I believe there is a poetry genre for everybody. So here in this video I'm going to give you some tips on how to get started with poetry, because I know poetry can be very daunting just because, as I said, the output is just so huge. You don't know where to start. My number one tip, my first tip, is anthologies. Get yourself an anthology. Anthologies are a good way to get into poetry because they introduce you to new poems and also, perhaps more importantly, new poets. And they often do it in a way that is accessible, and they often give you a wide range of poetical styles, poetical genres, poetical time periods. So with a good general anthology you get a wide range of poems and poets to choose from. So what are some anthologies I would recommend? I actually have, I don't think you can see it behind me, but I have a book by Allie Esiri, Allie Esiri. Apologies if I'm pronouncing that wrong. And it is a poem for every night of the year. I also know that she does a poem for every day of the year, and also I think she's done a series of books based on the seasons: spring, summer, autumn and winter. And I will leave the links down to her books on Amazon below. So that book, A Poem for Every Night of the Year, one, it's got a beautiful cover. Her covers for all her poetry books are amazing, but also they're good because she has one poem for every night of the year. And some of the poems, I was like, yeah, they're alright. But then some of her other poems I really liked. And also she also introduced me to poets that even I hadn't really read much of. So there was a really good introduction to poetry. Also, because there are so many anthologies out there, my tip would be actually to go, if you can, go to your local library. Your local library, at least the ones down in my area, often have at least 2 or 3, if not even more, anthology books on poetry. Just grab yourself a copy and just dip into it. Just dive right into it. And the thing is with poetry anthologies, and actually poetry in general, unlike a novel, you don't have to read from cover to cover. I mean, the book I was talking about, Poem for Every Night of the Year, yes, you do read it every night of the year, but the good thing about poetry is that you can sort of dip in and out as you wish. So if you get an anthology, you can just, look at the content, or just dive right in and dip into it and then dip out again. It's fine. So that would be my first tip. Check out any anthologies you can get your hands on, because they are a great way to really get yourself acquainted with different kinds of poetry by different kinds of authors. Sorry, I will use it. My second tip is to check out the different websites that are available online. Heidi ho, voiceover Rebecca here, and here I am introducing you to websites that I go to when I want to look up poetry, both old favourites of mine and also to get to know some new poems and poets. The first one is the Poetry Archive. It is, as the title suggests, an archive of poetry from different periods, from both men, women, and everything in between, and from around the world. And it is based in the UK, and the poems are in English, and it has different search functions. For one thing, you can just search a poet or poet's name if you know what you want to look for, or you can click on the button above and start to explore the archive. There are different tabs, one dedicated to poems, where you can just browse at your leisure the different sort of poems that are on offer. I especially like the one tab that's called Collections, and you can look at different sort of collections of poetry, so poetry on a theme. For instance, they have one on spring, which they have a few by authors both living and dead. Now, what I really like about the Poetry Archive is the fact they really emphasize poetry as something to be listened to. So they often have not only the poems themselves that you can read, but also the poem is also listed in spoken form. So you can actually listen to the poet or someone else actually reading the poem. An example here is Seamus Heaney's Mossborn Sunlight. So yes, that's definitely my first one, poetryarchive.org, or you can just Google the Poetry Archive. The second one is the American-based Poetry Foundation. Now this one's a bit more in depth. Like, for example, they do have essays, they also talk about different events, and they also have interviews as well with different people in the poetry community. But what I usually go for is the top selection, and it is Poems and Poets. And you can look at poem guides, poem of the day, and collections. And what I like, my favourite probably one is the collections. It's a bit like the Poetry Archive, where it's a collections of poems on a theme. So this one is all about the lovable cat, and unlike the Poetry Archive, this one is a little bit more in depth and a bit more thorough. So you not only get like an article about poems and cats, but you also get different kind of selections. So yeah, so you've got a wide range to choose from. Just all about cats. So those are the two websites I look at, the Poetry Archive and the Poetry Foundation. I will leave both links in the description below. Okay, so you've checked out your anthologies and you've checked out some websites. But what if you want to go further but you're still not really sure? Well, I have 3 tips that can maybe help you after your initial introduction to poetry to go in a bit more of a deep dive into it. And the first tip is your subject matter. Poetry covers all kinds of... Hang on a second. My first tip for you is subject matter. Poets across the centuries have covered an enormous range of subject matter. So, what I would suggest to you is to figure out what interests you and what kind of poetry would you like to read about. So, for example, would you like to read about nature? Or would you like to read about spirituality? Or would you like to read about the city or the some more urban environment? Or would you, and poetry is very good at this, like to read about love? Decide on your subject and go from there. My second tip is to look at poetical form or poetical style. Reading the anthologies and reading the websites, you would have gained a grounding to some of the different styles of poetry that is out there. Now, I'm not going to give you a big long spiel about different styles. I'll save that for a later video. But what you need to figure out is what kind of poetry do you like. If you've read anthologies and websites, you probably have gained a bit of an insight into what kinds of poetry attracted you the most. You know, what kind of poems did you stick with? What poems grabbed your attention? So that would be good for the subject matter as well. But there's also very key in terms of style. Style is basically, did you like poems that rhymed? Did you like more free verse? Did you like poems that were epic, that would take multiple pages? Or did you like the more shorter poems? Discern that, decide on that, and then go from there. And my third tip, yes I can count, my third tip is time period. I feel this is extremely helpful because there have been sort of eras of poetry, let's just say. There's like the modernist era that was in the early 20th century. There was the Romantics, obviously, in the 17th century, 17th, 18th century. There's obviously the Victorians, which were during the Victorian period. And there's often in anthologies and in websites, but particularly anthologies, I find they are quite good in giving a wide range of poets from a wide range of different periods. So, reading those anthologies, you will be, hopefully you have sort of found a poet or even a couple of poets that would have attracted you. If you've done so, check out what time period they were. So if you like Lord Byron, he was a Romantic. If you liked Tennyson, he was in the Victorian era. If you liked T.S. Eliot, he was in the Modernist era. So once you find that out, then you can kind of go back and see what other, for example, if you like T.S. Eliot, what other modernist poets were writing around that time. Doesn't mean that just because you like T.S. Eliot, you're like all modernist poets, but it's a good place to start. So I really hope that all these tips were helpful. I'll give you all the links to the websites and to Poem for Every Night of the Year book that I recommended down below. So I'll see you later.